I always considered myself lucky to have grown up in New York City. It was a bubble, but also such a microcosm for how the world worked in many ways. You couldn't avoid encountering people different from you, or even really the painful realities that others had to go through. Because both the wonders of New York City and the displays of systemic oppression were in public. My first clear experience witnessing racism came when I was 8. I had a nanny named Sophie, and she was family to us. She had immigrated from Jamaica about 30 or 40 years before she started working with my brother and me. And she brought her 7 children with her. And I don't know how, but as a black immigrant in New York City, she somehow raised all 7 kids by herself. She was a force. And she was also about my height. So, only those who really knew her actually understood how mighty she was. And that's why 8-year-old me couldn't understand why the two of us could not, for the life of us, get a taxi. It was raining, and I was trying to meet up with my mom, and taxis that had the available light on kept driving by Sophie as she stood in the rain with her hand raised. Here you had a 75-year-old woman drenched with an 8-year-old child, and nobody would stop. Did they not see us? Were we too short? And because she was such a proud woman, she wouldn't let me see the pain that she must have felt. But after 45 minutes of watching taxis pass us by, and finally watching a cab slow down only to speed back up upon seeing Sophie, the reason started to dawn on me. So I walked about 15 feet away and put my hand up. And within 30 seconds, we had a cab. This was life in New York City. And sadly, it often became the punchline in jokes. If you were black, good luck getting a taxi. For those of us with white privilege and wealth, both categories that I fell into, it didn't quite dawn on us that if it was that hard for people of color to get a taxi, how much harder was it to be treated equally in job searches, housing applications, or by law enforcement? We saw what was directly in front of our face, but that doesn't mean we were paying attention. I remember being privy to so many conversations about how racism had been solved in the civil rights movement. There were still racists out there, but the systemic stuff had been defeated. Worst of all, this was a message that I remember receiving in my history textbooks at my glitzy private school. Sure, it recognized moments like the Rodney King beating, but it was characterized as a bleak moment in a situation trending in the right direction. Now I look back, and I really wonder whether it was naivete, willful ignorance, or malice that led to those characterizations of racism as a thing of the past. And wonder, despite the evidence, despite what those of us with privilege have witnessed, and what we hear from our siblings without white privilege, why is it still so hard to stare racism in the eye, acknowledge the systems that are enmeshed in our lives, and act as if lives depend on it? Lives do depend on what we do, and even more on what we don't. Ever since seminary, I have been captivated by a particular story from the Hebrew Bible because it was so horrifying that I felt compelled to understand why it was there. The story tells of ancient Israel's judge Jephthah, who goes to war and makes a vow to God that if he is successful, he will sacrifice as a burnt offering the first creature to come out of his house when he returns. And when he returns home, the first to greet him is his daughter. When he cries in devastation and tells his daughter of his vow, she requests 2 months in the wood to cry for her virginity. Since in those days, what was most relevant was that she would not be able to provide an heir. And 2 months later, she is sacrificed in front of the whole town. Many people wrestle with this story, myself included, because it is an unfathomable evil done in the name of God. But I've always believed the point of this story is to alert us to our own silence and inaction when evil is perpetuated under moral auspices. Because history shows us how we have lived this story 100 different times. And what it means to be attentive to history is that stories that are told over and over have something fundamental to teach us. In this case, that silence will always be our default unless we act with courage. As much as we like to believe that Unitarian Universalists have a more generous and liberal history in confronting evil, sadly, history is not kind to us in that regard. Unitarian history, in particular, reminds us of our inaction in the face of slavery. There is a grand total of one Unitarian minister who was a staunch abolitionist, Theodore Parker. And he was famously kicked out of Unitarian ministry for his sermon on the transient and permanent in Christianity. It is considered a moment of absolute failure in our history. And freedom of the pulpit is one important lesson we have learned from that moment. The lesson that we haven't learned was how to respond to being called out for our inaction in the face of evil, injustice, and racism. It's easy to forget that Parker was not just kicked out for questioning whether Jesus' status as prophet, divine, or human mattered. Parker pointed out that something was wrong if we cared more about debating the status of Jesus than enacting his teachings in the world. It was a direct call out to those who refused to join him in justice work and felt the primary purpose of the faith was an intellectual pursuit devoid of action to dismantle slavery. He argued that faith was meaningless. It was transient if we stayed in our heads and debated theology. True faith was about fighting evil, lifting up humans being oppressed, and living the ministry of Jesus. He was calling out his colleagues for their inaction on slavery, and they knew it. They were watching humans be sacrificed and doing nothing. when I was growing up, and even when I was studying in seminary, by far my least favorite aspect of Christianity was the Passion, because I did not see what the point of showing all that suffering could serve. It had been used repeatedly to encourage anti-Semitism, so it was a part of the New Testament that I tried to avoid. Even when I was willing to look at Jephthah's daughter, the Passion held a different personal wound for me. But this week, as I was thinking what compassion truly means, the Latin, to suffer with, it occurs to me that the point of the Passion as a story, and what's relevant for us, and what I think was relevant for Parker, was not the degradation, but the fact that he kept walking while carrying that cross. When people use the idiom that it is a cross they bear, they are saying that they will be suffering amid carrying a burden, but that they will keep moving forward anyway. And that is what it means to be compassionate with those who are forced to keep going despite their burdens. We must choose to move forward. We must choose to learn from history and from our failures. Not to turn away, but to lean in. For those of us who have white privilege and financial privilege, it is especially incumbent upon us to interrupt moments of racism and unsafety for people of color when we ourselves do not feel we would be in danger. One of the things that our black siblings tell us they live with every day is the fear that a garden variety interaction with police could turn deadly for them through no fault of their own. Gabrielle Hooks shared a story of her experience in Berkeley just a week ago. She was leaving a bar, not intoxicated, with her friend. And as they said goodbye, she pulled out her phone from her bag and started looking through it. She was immediately stopped by 2 police officers who had been parked there, who accused her of stealing her own phone. They said it matched the description of a stolen phone that had been reported because it had a pink cover. Fortunately, 2 bystanders were there recording and talking her through her obvious fear while being interrogated for something that she hadn't done. They told the police over and over again that she hadn't done anything, that they didn't have the right to take her property or arrest her without cause. Visibly shaking, Gabrielle didn't know how to convince these officers that this phone was hers. The white bystander suggested that she lock her phone and unlock it. And the second she unlocked her phone with her face, the police reluctantly left. This is why I think the story of Jephthah's daughter is about showing us what we can do differently this time. That we don't have to repeat history and sacrifice our kindred. It's hard, but we have the power to stand up against injustice rather than watch it happen. Even the Bible tells that story. A few generations after Jephthah, the first king of Israel, Saul, makes a very similar vow to God. And the person to break his vow is his son, Jonathan. And as he is about to sacrifice his son to God, the people step in and say no to the king. that gives me hope because it speaks to our ability to fight even the most powerful perpetrators of evil. Even perpetrators that don't know what they're doing is evil. Prophets speak to the painful injustice of our world, but today's prophets cannot end with words. I believe that we can be prophets, but that will only happen when we name and then act on the painful truths of systemic racism and keep moving forward, even if we want to turn back. History compels us to look at the fire, to feel the flames, and then break whatever built that pyre and make sure it does not get back up in a new form. Do you see a black person being interrogated by police? Take out your phone and record. Do you notice children of color being treated differently in schools? Speak up. The river of racism is deep. It is cold. And it builds a pyre for us to sacrifice beloved members of our human family every day. But I have faith that we will get to the other side because we can be stewards of history and compassion. We can say no more. Parker was sure that the universe bends towards justice. So was Martin Luther King Jr. So let's prove them right. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.